guest today is Greg Headley. Greg is a data scientist at Informed Solutions, a UK-based technology firm that builds AI and data systems for some of the most high-stakes environments imaginable: healthcare regulation, national policing, emergency services, and critical government infrastructure. Now, there's a lot of companies out there claiming to do AI. What makes Informed different is their track record. They've won 2 Queen's Awards for innovation. They've been delivering data science to UK government clients for over 8 years. And just last month, they became one of the first 10 organisations in the UK to achieve ISO's 42001 certification. This is the world's first international standard for responsible AI. Their client list speaks for itself. The UK's National Health Service, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, the Metropolitan Police, the National Crime Agency, the Home Office, and many more. These guys are the real deal. Greg has an interesting background. American by birth, based in the UK, he started in geophysics processing seismic data before pivoting to data science. He now helps organisations navigate the messy reality of actually deploying AI in environments where trust is everything and failure is not an option. In this conversation, we get into the multi-disciplinary approach that Informed takes, why 95% of AI deployments reportedly add no value, and why that statistic is misleading. We also cover the importance of standards like ISO 42001, the role of digital twins in crisis management, and what Greg sees as the biggest risks and opportunities in AI over the next 5 years. This is a masterclass in responsible AI from someone who's actually doing it at scale. Make sure you grab a coffee, get a pen, and take note, because this isn't an update from another LinkedIn AI influencer. This is advice from the people influencing and building artificial intelligence that is changing the world as we know it. Please enjoy my conversation with Greg Headley. I think today we're going to go through some stuff that a lot of our listeners I know are really interested to learn more about, particularly around technology, cyber, AI. It's a massive topic at the moment, as I'm sure you're experiencing as well. So there's probably a huge range of things we can get through. But before we jump into that kind of serious stuff, I'm really interested to know about your story. How did you find your way into data science and the world of responsible AI, all that stuff? Give us a bit of a background, I suppose.
Yeah, certainly. I think, in principle, I suppose I've been doing something data related for about the last 10 or 12 years. You can probably tell by the accent, even though I'm in Britain, I grew up in America and I came over for university at 18, studied maths, and then I went into geophysics of all things. And worked in big seismic data processing for a number of years, but got increasingly more interested in the more general sort of data landscape, not just seismic data, but what can you do with arbitrary data sets, and eventually went and did a master's degree in data science. So for the last 5 years, I've been doing sort of out and out data science. I worked in wearables actually for a couple of years, and then moved over to Informed about 3 years ago. And it's been a really expanding my horizon and my sort of view of all of the different technologies and ways that you can deliver data science solutions. We work for a lot of different organizations, and in particular a lot in public sector, and that means that you get exposure to all of the different layers of government and all of the things that get done, from healthcare to policing. The list sort of goes on, as you can imagine, with government. So it's an exciting time to be in the space, and I'm enjoying getting to learn so much from so many different organizations.
For sure, yeah. I I'm still learning a lot about what informed solution does, I think, because it's so broad, and the expertise that's available is pretty top notch from what I'm understanding. And so I'm keen to know sort of what is it about informed solutions multidisciplinary approach that really shapes how you think about AI and data strategy today? Joining the team, do you think it's shaped your thinking around this sort of thing?
I really do. And I think that you're right to highlight the multidisciplinary approach. I think you see, in particular in the AI space, you see a lot of these kind of AI startups or sort of AI houses, AI consultancies, and they are particularly focused on the power of the new technology, I think, which seems totally right, but often fall into the trap of just delivering the tech. And one of the elements to the informed recipe that I think is really successful is that we bring together these different disciplines. So broadly, we're organized on the technical side, at least, into 5 disciplines. There's software engineering, as you can imagine. Then we have what we call delivery management, which is the sort of project management, which I don't think is ordinarily captured as its own kind of technical discipline inside an org. It's kind of taken for granted as a guarantee that you have to have it. But I actually think it allows us, having it as a technical discipline allows us to reinforce some of the really important skills there. We also have user-centered design, which, to that prior point about sort of out and out AI delivery house, I think that for me, I hadn't had, until I joined Informed, I didn't have the same kind of appreciation for how important that discipline in particular is to successful, tech delivery more broadly. The, centering, grounding your entire delivery in user needs and what is going to move the needle for them is so critical for, end-to-end success, basically. Then we have data science. So, related to the software engineering group, but obviously with different responsibilities and technical ownership. And then we also have a live services team or discipline that recognizes, that some things need bigger systems or long-running systems. We built and then run something called the clean air zones, sort of payment and orchestration system in the UK for charging. Around London and some other areas, there are sort of checkpoints along the motorway where if you step over the boundary, then you're in the fee zone. So that's a pretty complicated and big set of infrastructure. So then we obviously need a team to make sure that it's got
Running.
high uptime and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, exactly.
It feels like there's a lot of your customers need a lot of trust in you, right? To as you just said, there's infrastructure that needs to be up and running 24/7, but then there's this. It's high stakes technology, right? So, are there any projects that kind of come to mind other than maybe the one you've just mentioned there with the zoning that make you think has actually shaped how Informed makes that happen and makes clients realize that that trust and the ethics and that awareness of high stakes technology is there?
Yeah, I would probably lean, for my own experience, on what's actually currently ongoing, but we did a big piece of work for the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. They're, listeners might be familiar with the US FDA. They're kind of like the FDA in that they're charged with they're the regulator basically for anything that goes in your body. So it might be something like a pacemaker, or an injectable of some kind, but then it's also in particular pharmaceuticals and clinical trials. And we did this piece of work with the clinical trials team to, try and improve the productivity and efficiency of their workflows for what they call clinical trial authorization. So this is it's a relatively small team, maybe 30 individuals, but they're all, deep, like really deep PhD educated sort of subject matter experts in medicine, in pharmacology, toxicology. And, they have this very central remit to approve clinical trials, which eventually, make it, ideally from the applicant's perspective, make it into people, get sold at some point. So, they have this burden on them to make sure that they're fair and they're, rigorous, and that they don't let things slide that aren't safe. And so, going into that environment, looking to deliver software and to deliver AI tooling, you have maybe the highest burden. We're talking medical data as well. So there's, as you can imagine, the kind of GDPR trappings of that,
right,
and how you have to secure the data. So I can give you more detail about sort of how we approached that, but I found that project in particular, it got me thinking much more deeply about how you design systems and tools to be like a force multiplier for those sorts of people. You don't want to get in their way, but you want to give them something that's useful, but you also want to give them something that they trust, right? Is it going to give me the right answer? Is it going to be faster than if I did it myself? Some of those kinds of dimensions become really important.
Do you think when that conversation started with these guys that, I don't know how they engaged with you first. Maybe they came to Informed Solutions first, which is a different angle. But what's it got to take for them to trust you guys with such extremely sensitive data and work here? And is there an element of you having to prove and show what you're going to do and case studies and those sorts of things? Or is it just having a conversation?
I would say, it with a piece of work like that, it's not probably going to be that easy to break in without some of those case studies, and I think in that respect, you can fall into that paradox a little bit of, it's like when you're looking for a job, people don't want to hire you because you don't have experience, but you can't get experience if you don't get hired. But, that being said, there are lots of different ways you can leverage case studies into that trust dimension. So, as I said, we work for a lot of different public sector organizations. They're not all healthcare, so there's maybe, you can kind of build your way up in that respect of, we've done something that's maybe it's not medical data, but it's still important public sector data that, we've then demonstrated we have built a good solution, and, maybe we've handled some personally identifiable information, but we've done it in a secure way and respected data privacy in the right ways. Some of those kinds of, proof points, I guess, that you understand the importance of taking it seriously, and particularly, I think, on the governance side, that goes a long way to keeping people. What's the right word? I'm trying to think. That they can trust, I guess, as you say, and
Like the long-term trust, I guess, almost.
Yeah, exactly, right. And like these guys can be dependable. We've seen them operate before in this way.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting piece, because you've got the idea of organizational trust. They're about to embark on a massive project. You're their vendor. And then the other side of the coin here, what I'm picking up is there's public trust as well, that, what you've just built or are building is going to be reliable, safe, all those sorts of things. And we're certainly over this side of the world in the APAC part of things. We're seeing a lot of digital transformation, as I know you guys are involved in a little bit as well, particularly in Malaysia and Australia. You've got the likes of this concept of smart cities in Malaysia. Digital health in Australia is pretty big, kind of mirroring the UK, fintech in Singapore. I personally don't think public trust is keeping up with it, though, and keeping pace. Why do you think that trust is so fragile, particularly when it comes to things like AI and digital transformation? What can we do to kind of change that narrative that we can trust vendors?
I think, and not to get too philosophical here, but I do think ultimately, some part of it goes to the heart of the human condition. The including the word intelligence, I think, really adds a burden on the domain, in the sense of it's I think back to, what was it, sort of October, it's about this time 3 years ago, when ChatGPT went public. Certainly for me, even in the industry, it was, and I think this was true for a lot of people, it was the first time that people are familiar with the Turing test, right? Can you design a machine that's good enough that you can't tell you're talking to a machine? And a lot of people would argue that the Turing test was passed decades ago, but chatting with ChatGPT felt like a authentic, organic conversation in a lot of ways with a person, and that, I think, can be quite confronting for people. It can trigger sort of visceral response, I think, in a lot of individuals, and concern about, what does this mean for me and the things that I do in my job, or, another sort of parallel, I suppose, is in the data space. We've been conditioned, perhaps over the last 20 years or so, to be the product, as it relates to data. I don't know if you're familiar with I don't know who it's attributed to, but there's as it relates to social media, right? There's this thing: if the service is free, you're not the customer, you're the product.
Yes.
And I think, myself included, like, a lot that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. And so for me, some of it is the underlying nature of the technology makes trust hard. I think some of it is that a lot of the things that have happened in the digital revolution since the internet set people up to be less trusting, especially in this data space, because so much of what the data that we produce is getting used, maybe, hopefully, with our permission, sometimes maybe without it. But you want to have a sense of that, I suppose. And then I guess the last thing is probably the kind of standard tech adoption curve. Tech skepticism, or there's that sort of chasm. There's the early adopters, like, oh yeah, like, I totally want the new Tesla that's 200,000 pounds or whatever. And then nobody else follows them. And then it takes a number of years before you see the upswing of kind of mainstream adoption and popularity. So it's a mixed bag, I guess.
Are you or your team seeing trust in AI being harder to get by because of things like ChatGPT? You're saying, because I agree. I think when you talk to ChatGPT or any of these LLMs, they were good 3 years ago, but now it's getting unbelievable. I mean, people are using them for mental health. They're whether that's positive or negative, that's another topic in itself. So do you guys see that the trust is perhaps actually going backwards again because they're so convincing, or is it helping?
It can go. It's interesting, I think, and this is not unique to AI. I think it's true with a lot of technologies that, people see publicity for, but they don't have sort of fundamental understanding of, if that makes sense. Like there's a tremendous amount of hype and conversation happening in the public domain in this space right now. I think we're still on the journey of users and organizations educating themselves on what's really possible. And I think that's certainly what I face a lot of the time is educating people on what their expectations should be. There's I see a lot on the polls, right? People are either really skeptical that it can do what everyone says it can do. And then there's people on the other side that also, think it's sort of a magic wand and can do sort of anything fairly easily. And as always, right, the truth is somewhere in the middle, and it depends on the domain and it depends on the problems that you're trying to solve. The current AI tech is pretty good at some things and it needs a lot of configuration or a lot of, extra engineering to be good at other things.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's a good point. I was recently reading I want to say it was McKinsey did a report on, the top 500 businesses and whether they're adopting AI at a large enterprise level or where they're putting it and why they're putting it in. And what was interesting was a lot of executives, trust was that big issue, and not necessarily trust with AI as a whole, because as you're saying, technology needs trust regardless of what it's doing, especially if it's going to replace full systems and processes. This report, it's a couple of months, probably 6 months ago now, I'd say, but the report highlighted that they're not moving on it to a large degree like the media says they are, because they're still too nervous about what it could do or what it can't do and how much money it's going to cost. And I know you guys actually do that sort of AI readiness piece as well as a project. And yeah, that is a great example of coming in and saying, is this right for you guys? And if it is, where does it go and what does it do? And maybe a few more people need to take you guys up on that. But what have you seen as being that kind of high trust behaviors or governance practices that separate leaders from those laggards? You're talking about that kind of the adoption curve. What are the things you're seeing that differentiates them?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that when trust is absent or it's lacking, and I think this runs across the board, regardless of business or relationships or whatever, you want to build it up incrementally. You want to give, an opportunity to do something trustworthy, and then for people to see that be reinforced, and that's how you start to build up momentum. Our view, certainly, and this goes back to your original question about the multidisciplinary approach, is to focus on delivering, AI solutions and proposals and things like that within the that same kind of context of robust delivery. There's a lot of things that are new and interesting about AI, but there's also a lot of stuff that's the same. You still have users, so you still have to involve them. I think in that arena, we find it really important to have human in the loop sort of baked in to the solutions that we design. So the kind of standard mantra is it's decision support, not decision making. And the small tweaks like that rhetorically sound sort of straightforward do make a big difference, both to the users because they're integral to the solution and they're part of the journey. But then, also, so in the MHRA example, right, that the solution's not directly public facing, but the outcomes of what the assessors decide to do, absolutely has a downstream public impact. So there's multiple layers of trust that you have to consider there, right? How do you get the users, the subject matter experts in these assessors to trust the systems? But then also, how do you architect those systems so that if, especially in government, somebody files a freedom of information request because they want to know how this thing works, they feel comfortable when they learn, oh, okay, there's no automated decision making. This is a productivity multiplier, to AI tool that they're using, but it's not, the AI is taking over all of our mission critical decision making.
Does that happen enough though? I feel like that's not something I know people are checking, and maybe it sounds like they should.
I think, and I think it's not just the kind of practicalities of trust in that respect. I think that in my experience, you also get better systems out of introducing human intervention or human reinforcement, sometimes it's called, into these systems. For me, going back to the point about dedicated AI houses, ultimately the goal for us is impact. And sometimes the other side of that coin is engineering or technology. People want to deploy the cool technology, and that becomes the goal, instead of how do we have a meaningful impact, be it cost savings, be it productivity gains for users. With the MHRA, there's not a lot of them. There's a lot of applications. These assessors are just drowning in work all the time. So how do we relieve some of that burden? But recognizing that for a whole host of reasons, those assessors need to be the ones making the call, not yet, at least, you're not suing an AI model, right? Some person is the one going to court that's representing the government or whatever in a lawsuit. So those individuals are ultimately responsible and accountable for the decisions that they make and of the agency. And I think that reinforces that you don't want to hand those kinds of things off to a model, regardless of how intelligent it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was having a conversation with a retired executive who was talking about this idea that you've got some individuals, mostly out of Silicon Valley in America, saying we'll have these one-man, one-woman unicorns, and they won't need anyone because their team will be AI. And the funny thing to me is, when there's a crisis and they've got to stand in front of media, I want to meet the human being who says that the AI prepared them for that interview, and the advice they got was from their chatbot and all this sort of stuff. I just can't see it, to be honest. But and no one's going to, the public who's lost their data, they're not going to accept that as an answer. So yeah,
well, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah,
yeah. AI readiness, though, what does that kind of mean in practical terms, and how do we get ready for what's coming? Because it just feels like every day there's a new release. I was just playing with Google's Banana, whatever it is, the new image
Nano Banana
tool, and that's it. I couldn't believe that. That's scary how good that is. How do we get ready for this sort of stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I can appreciate the question in particular because I've spent a lot of the last 6 months refining and delivering our what, as you alluded to there, what we call our AI readiness assessment. And this was, you know, maybe a little bit of context, that this was born out of a desire to plug a gap that we were starting to notice with a lot of our customers, that they had a motivation and interest to deliver AI, but a lot of uncertainty, you know, as you alluded to previously, a lot of distrust or apprehension. I don't know what it can do. I don't know how to get it into my organization, and I really don't want to spend, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds, millions of pounds, whatever, to try and go dive straight in on some kind of delivery project. So, you know, first and foremost, it's kind of a de-risking exercise, right? It's about trying to understand the landscape of your organization. We sort of view it, and our assessment is built around 3 lenses that we look through at the organizational level. Data, and there's a lot to unpack there. Technology, and then people. And obviously, I'm closest to the data side. I think one of the observations that I have had is, you know, through the 2010s, as compute got a lot faster and scalable, AI and ML really build up a lot of momentum, and you see breakthroughs in computer vision, breakthroughs in natural language understanding, and a lot of organizations that were early adopters were spending a lot of time curating their data sets, building data platforms, adding metadata, you know, really evolving the really critical data side of this equation. And I think one of the underappreciated negatives for me with the generative revolution is that a lot of momentum has stalled on that really critical foundational data work. It's a cliche, but people say, right? They say rubbish in, rubbish out, garbage in, garbage out. And that, I think, is manifest in what we see the LLMs spit out, right? You see, people call it AI slop, but there's still, you know, they're getting better. And if you're in the sort of center of the distribution, you can get a good concrete answer. But as soon as you start to get off of the training data, you know, a lot of things really start to fall apart. And that, I think, is only exacerbated when you try and do very domain specific activities or things that are aligned specifically with your data, right? Because it's proprietary data sets, documents, those sorts of things. If you haven't done the work to establish good data governance, data platforms, you know, so the data is discoverable and it's been enriched with context and metadata, you know, maybe some of the human expertise that sort of is a bit ephemeral and is not lives in somebody's head about a particular data set. You know, do you have ways to capture that and digitize that so that it can be used by a model? You know, on the technology side, there's lots of layers. You know, we're still, and I'm sure this is especially true in APAC. Organizations are still getting on board with the cloud. What does it mean? Which provider? What tools are available? What data do I move to the cloud? What do I keep on-prem? You know, how do I leverage these tools? What's cost effective? How do I approve new deployments? You know, all those kinds of layers to understanding the tech landscape. Also really critical. Obviously, cybersecurity falls under that banner. and then the last lens on the people side, it goes to a lot of what we've been talking about. What's the trust landscape with the business, with the potential users of the AI that you might be considering? Are you not considering any AI? Do we need to go and canvas for use cases from domain experts or particular groups? How do you think about and tackle getting those people in the boat and bringing them on the journey with you? It's always going to be harder if you're swimming upstream against your own teams with deployment and delivery of these kinds of systems. So it is in a lot of ways organizational wide in that respect, that the successful AI deployments, have readiness across all three lenses. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? You can start small. You can find use cases that speak to a really painful user need in one slice, or a sort of a minor annoyance that runs across for everybody. But that getting one of the main outputs that we often present off the back of the AI readiness assessment is to get started and get something into production, as we would say. You learn a tremendous amount about how your organization works, about what the challenges are. It becomes a pathfinder project or experience. Just doing that, let's knock down the barriers to getting live. And it might not be perfect, and iteration will be required, and refinement and feedback and evaluation. But we're going to learn where our gaps are. We're going to learn where resistance lives, maybe inside the organization, who is particularly important to bring along the journey. All of those things come out of the woodwork when you set aside the kind of, we'll do a proof of concept, and then that gets shelved.
Yeah.
Get one that you think you have, where you might have something, and get it into production and start measuring how much value it adds.
I really want to pick up on what you just said there around the productivity piece, because I think in that same McKinsey report, what they'd identified was that really these massive businesses that got, huge global presence, tens of thousands of staff, they were realizing that they had verticals that they needed to fix, and those processes and systems and whatever. And then by reviewing where AI could fit into it, the work they actually ended up doing was almost like an audit of revisiting. It's a productivity exercise. It almost had nothing to do with AI, but it made them think about, hold on, we really need to fix this in the first place. And so I assume you then reinvent that, because if you want to put AI in it, you kind of got to reinvent it anyway. And it gives you another opportunity to start cleaning up mess, and hopefully AI can help there. But at least at the end of the day, it's that topic and conversation starter, I think, to revisit those systems and whatnot.
Yeah, and I do think that this is one of the things that is not attributed well to the value add of AI. You probably are familiar with this MIT report that came out in July that said like 95% of AI solutions add no value, or AI deployments aren't adding any value. And you see that headline, and for me, one of the things over the course of my career that I have found to be important is, and it goes to the kind of nature of science itself, is to be skeptical. So I saw that number and I thought, that seems quite confidently high. I'd like to see the methodology. And when you sort of unpack it, there are some of those layers, right? That in doing the hard yards to look at your business processes, to look at your data estate, you learn things that are maybe a little bit intangible in terms of the bottom line, but allow you to level up in terms of efficiency in how your organization is run, and how the governance practices that you put in place. And even if you don't choose the right use case for the first deployment, or you have to do a few proofs of concept to find one that you think holds water, you still learned a tremendous amount about, as you alluded to there with that example, what it takes and where the sensible sort of application of capital, I guess, really is what it comes down to, is going to live. Where are people doing things a lot of the time? They're spending a lot of time on something, or a lot of people are spending a little time on something, or this adds a new capability that allows us to get something to market twice as fast as we were able to previously, right? There's all kinds of different use cases and applications, but that introspection task is critical to finding out, where you can really extract value from these technologies.
You mentioned earlier about governance, and I'm kind of keen to look at that a little bit, because I was having a conversation with a consultant a while ago, and he was looking at changing his career, and I jokingly said that there's probably a lot of value in doing AI governance and policy at the moment, because the versions I've seen of it over this side of the world are not good. There's a lot there, and then you've got the ISO 42001, I think we're up to now.
That's the one.
Currently going through that world of pain, I understand. So can you walk us through that a little bit? Like, the international standards like that are obviously, it's good that they're emerging quickly, particularly how fast AI is moving in the adoption of it. Why do you think leaders should care about this, though? What kind of problems do these standards solve, particularly from a governance perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think the place to start is recognizing that, and we touched on it earlier, that this technology has grown exceptionally quickly, and as a consequence, both regulations but also standards are lagging behind. Certainly the technology, and I think a lot of the adoption as well, as you suggested there. So I think the important point to make is markets without standards are inefficient at best, I would suggest, and corrupt at worst, right? When you don't have an agreed standard of how we are doing things, it opens the door for bad actors to take advantage of people who maybe are ignorant of what good looks like. I think standards are a good way for us to agree, what's effective, what's fair, what's secure, how do we govern these things. So yeah, as you alluded to there, I was sat yesterday in our certification audit for the 42001 standard just yesterday, and we see that as, I think, we're one of the first 10, maybe first 5 in the UK to go for the certification.
Wow.
They've only just gotten the agreed upon kind of audit scheme through. So we're also, cybersecurity 27001 certified. So we see real value, I think, especially because of the amount of work we do with government that often want to see that evidence. But even, aside from that, I think having an agreed upon set of standards makes all the difference for you to be able to deliver with confidence and, on budget, on time, right, to a high standard. So I don't know, I guess I think we're better off in a world where we have some standards that can tell us what good looks like than a total Wild West where we're sort of at the mercy of these model producers.
And they need to happen quick, right? Because as you're saying, things are moving quick and they need to evolve to do that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think standards, well, how do we get these standards and the governance to help enable innovation rather than restrict it? Because I know that's a big issue for a lot, particularly with this side of the world, actually. New Zealand doesn't move fast enough for this sort of stuff. We don't really have that many policies around cyber either. And my understanding is it's because they're worried it will stunt growth and innovation, those sorts of things. Is that true? Do you see that? Or is it's got to happen, it's necessary?
I think, it can depend. Depends on the domain. I think in this space in particular, technology more broadly, but especially this one, having agreement on how we do things, especially for the fundamentals, is really important actually to enable innovation. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, there's an ISO standard for like credit card payment messaging. And you think, well, that is essential for basically global card payments to move smoothly. In the absence of that standard, what are people doing? You end up with this fragmentation of process, and that leads to massive market inefficiency. Whereas, if we can use that standard, we can all agree, this is how we're doing things on the fundamentals. Like, you send me this message, I understand it, I send you back the same thing. Great. Now I can spend my important time, my creativity on developing new financial products for my customers, innovative things that didn't exist before. There's lots of these examples. I think IT hardware is another good example, like the plug that you use for Ethernet or USB-C, right? Like, let's just agree that life is a lot easier if we all do the same thing. And that's how you make creativity flourish, right? Because you're not bogged down in, now we need to invent a communication protocol. No, we'll just adopt the standard, and other people are using the standard, and it's, someone else has done the thinking. Someone else has developed the process. And, there's I'm obviously quite familiar with 42001 now, but it's thoughtful and it gives you a recipe for, not just successful delivery, secure and transparent and observable. So I don't know. I guess I would counter with, like, show me the examples of markets that don't have standards like these that operate at high efficiency.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be another podcast in itself, probably. The idea, I really like that answer. I mean, that's, I haven't actually thought of it that way myself either. Is this idea of, if that's covered, it gives you that space to think about other things, and that's where you start innovating, and you don't have to be distracted. That governance is sorted.
Yeah, let's get the process on rails so that our creative, savvy people can dedicate their effort to new things and innovative things.
Yeah, give them the space to do what they're best at. What do we do from a smaller business perspective, those that can't get ISO accreditation, do you think? So I guess I'm thinking about small and medium-sized businesses, entrepreneurs, those sorts of things, that they still want to have, I guess, that kind of assurance and coverage, that idea of risk and protocols, etc. But, they're not going to go and get an ISO accreditation.
Yeah.
Is there any other frameworks or any other things they could do instead?
I mean, it's a bit of a cop-out, but I would say even just reading and understanding the standard, even if you're not looking to get certified, there are some fundamentals in the standard. I mean, that's what it is, right? But that do set you on the right path. So, I think there's maybe three things that stand out to me as the kind of core building blocks of something like that 42001 standard. One of them is centering your delivery around user needs, and it always surprises me how often that gets overlooked. Uh, you know, engineers building the thing or executives that feel like they know their business, and they probably do, enforce, this is what we're doing. This is going to make the difference. This is, we've looked at the P&L, and there's costs to be saved over here. And you see so many of those types of projects fail to deliver value because they don't see user adoption, or they sort of fly past each other, right? Like ships sailing past each other in the night. Like, users are going this way and your solution is going the other way, and it's like, this doesn't actually do anything for me, or the manual way is faster, or whatever it might be. So I think that's really critical. Obviously, being a standard, governance is important, and I think that word can feel bureaucratic, or it can feel sort of process laden. But again, kind of to the previous point about agreeing what we're doing, having those governance structures in place, from data to security, how do we do deployment? Once you agree upon that, you've greased the wheels, and you start seeing those benefits reinforced the next time, because you've already done that work and you already have those structures in place. And then the other thing that I would pursue if I was sort of looking to make best efforts to have some structure and maybe a bit of a framework, is to pay attention to observability, which I think gets overlooked in terms of its importance. I guess, what I mean by that is, like, it's being able to see how your data is flowing through your platform or your pipelines. Maybe how is it changing? Recognizing that there's a lot of fluidity in data, and we're constantly producing more. What are my models doing? How are they responding to user queries? How are they performing in terms of predictions against real world results? It's important to have like logs and sort of audit trails to be able to backtrack when something goes wrong. And all of that ultimately goes to important parts of the standard, like transparency, understanding and mitigating bias, and also obviously performance, which goes to, cost savings or value add. And all of those are building blocks of the standard. So I think if you can implement a first pass of those things, you're well on your way to evolving into a mature, AI enabled organization.
It's really funny because I know my co-founder over at Fixing will love that answer, because he runs, his programs, particularly for business continuity, just follow the ISO 22301 framework. And the positive of that is, regardless of whether you're going for the accreditation, you're on the same level of being trained and prepared as those who've got it anyway. So it's a win-win.
Yeah.
And that's quite a good point, because a small business could do that. It'll take a bit of work and commitment, and even you're talking about the observability piece, and that instantly sounds like I need to hire someone just to be monitoring that and being part of that, but it's still a worthwhile investment, and you're doing what those who are getting ISO standards are doing anyway. So
you don't need the certification to adopt the principles.
Yeah. And I guess that it's nice to have, particularly when you're in a tender scenario, but
Well,
having
yeah.
the principles is very nice anyway, when you're particularly if you're in a crisis scenario. Um, I want to pivot a little bit and talk about digital twins. Um, I was kind of hoping you could explain what that is for those that are listening who don't understand that, because I'll be honest, I only sort of recently figured out what it was, and I'm probably still wrong. So can you give us a bit of an idea of what that is and where informed solution fits into that world, and yeah, what you guys do there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the word doing the heavy lifting is the twin for me. Obviously, the digital is like the vehicle by which you deliver the twin, but the idea, you know, the origin I'm not certain of. I want to say it originally maybe came out of nuclear or something very sort of high stakes and critical. The idea being that you have some sort of real world system, whatever it might be, would take energy, for example, that's happening in the real world. And what becomes hard is being able to test different scenarios of what could happen in the real world. So the idea with the digital twin is that you build a model that is, the best approximation you have the budget for, that you can architect, that you can encapsulate to represent the real world system in a digital space. And the key insight or like thing that you unlock with that is that, the digital assets are zero consequence. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's some compute cost and stuff like that, but you then have a tool that you can poke and prod and simulate and test against. What if this transformer goes down? What does that have? What are the knock-on impacts of that? Oh, this hospital has to go into backup, and they only have 6 hours, of fuel in their backup generators, or something like that. So, ultimately, it's, I suppose, a simulation, or one of the primary benefits, I guess you would say, is the sort of ability to test and validate hypotheses, potentially identify shortcomings or gaps where failures could be catastrophic, without having to see the tsunami happen in the real world.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting. This morning I had a conversation with an emergency management professional who works for the civil defense, and we were talking about the evolution of crisis planning and disaster response, that sort of stuff. National readiness, I guess, is what it's called. And so it sounds to me that this is potentially part of that, right? And the better digital twins get, the better those planning and simulations will get to help tell us more about what could potentially go down, and that's kind of where this fits in.
Yeah, and we've maybe to put a concrete example on it, we've been working with the Department for Business and Trade, actually, in their National Digital Twin program, and that starts with a sort of pilot test case on the Isle of Wight, if memory serves, and it's about trying to connect critical systems together in the first instance in this digital space. So I don't work directly on that project, but I'm familiar with it, and I was involved early on. And if memory serves, there's energy connections, you might say, like feeds of data from live energy systems. There's traffic, like road network inputs. There's water. There's a lot of assets, you would say, for, in the sort of GIS context for floodplains and um, like tidal change, also different areas of vulnerability, not just from like natural vulnerability, but also vulnerability in the sort of poverty and scarcity and sort of sickness dimension. So those, having that kind of set of layers that represent what life is like on the ground, so that you can simulate, okay, if we had a flood here and that knocked out this bridge and it knocked out this power station, what's the consequence for this impoverished community on the edge of the island that's now, there's only one road for an ambulance to get to them, and when the ambulance gets to the hospital, they're on backup power, right? So being able to sort of hotspot and highlight things like that through the use of this really useful tool gives you that much more understanding and opportunity to prepare. I guess, and you'll be intimately familiar with this, right? In risk management, there's prevention and there's mitigation, and you always want to be in the prevention side of the equation if you can be, because that's where you save. That's where you prevent loss of life or loss of property damage or whatever the sort of big costly downsides are. And I think that's one of the big advantages of something like a digital twin, is that you can get a much better understanding and start to take action on what preventative actions are available to you.
What you're describing there sounds familiar to some tools I have seen here in New Zealand, but there is definitely a massive gap here. And again, back with that conversation I was having this morning, New Zealand has some extremely unique risks, particularly from a natural disaster perspective. We have something over here called AF8, which is the Alpine fault that runs straight through the country, or at least South Island. It's predicted to go off in any moment, basically, but 300-year gaps, and they're preparing for a magnitude 8+ earthquake. Now, there are systems that I've seen that can do what you're describing around this digital twin process, but some of them are only doing flooding, whereas the data for road networks hasn't been plugged into it yet. There's these huge gaps where they're kind of creating some of it, but not the whole entire picture. And what Brendan, who I spoke to this morning on our podcast, he was talking about some really interesting stuff around in Queenstown. If that Alpine fault goes in winter, the biggest audience down there that is going to face it are the Australians. There'll be 100,000 Australians over there, and they'll be stuck in an alpine village and unable to fly home because the airport's probably destroyed, And as he was talking about all this, I'm thinking, man, I just don't think people know this stuff really. And it's probably because they're not able to freely simulate it and build out all of these different scenarios in a sort of constructive way. And it's amazing that somewhere like the Isle of Wight or the UK are doing these sorts of things, but then New Zealand, that's prone to tsunamis, volcanoes, earthquakes, we're not really doing it as much as we should be, which is a bit of a shame. and something we're campaigning for. Yeah, I definitely see the value of this, particularly from that risk management, disaster planning area. And I'm assuming for you guys, because you do a lot of work with the police and emergency services, the government, health, those sorts of things. I'm assuming they're doing this all the time. Is that right?
I think you're seeing, as it relates specifically to digital twins, I think there's, it's building momentum. That the Department of Business and Trade example I gave there is maybe you might say like a Pathfinder project in a lot of ways, in trying to build out, we're talking about standards, right? Trying to build out the architecture for how to deliver these things, more easily. One of the things that stood out to me when you were talking there is, how do you, it's not a trivial exercise, I won't sugarcoat it to create these systems. In particular, when you have to deal with maybe complex physics in the case of, I'm a geophysicist, so I spent a lot of time studying natural disasters and earthquakes in particular, and they're quite hard to model, actually, in particular about like how the impacts are going to be seen, and where you're going to see the resonance that creates a lot of quake that then causes primary damage. So building out the twin can be an undertaking, and I think that's probably one of the things that makes adoption lower. But I suppose, to your question about other sort of emergency services and critical systems in the UK, I think that you see more organizations recognizing that they don't have to do the whole thing, right? You can start, and I would, my recommendation would be identify your areas of highest risk and build a baseline twin. And the same is true with conventional sort of data science solutions, right? We always look to try and build a base model, something that does an adequate job and wasn't prohibitively expensive to create. And I think the same holds in the digital twin space. So if flooding or like landslides are your biggest risk, acquire those data sets that of topography and rainfall and the inputs that would be required to do a good job of modeling and sort of simulating the physics of a landslide, and then get all of the assets of where people live and how that relates to that topography, and build a simple I say, but like an initial maybe digital twin of those systems. It's your area of highest risk and therefore probably highest cost, and you want to minimize that risk. So focus your energy there, and you're going to learn a ton about the things that you didn't know, and where your data is lacking. And we don't have any assets for hospitals. Well, that's a critical gap. Like, we really need to know that information. And you start to reveal those, and then it becomes more obvious. What's really important, actually, we get this into the digital twin, because it really enhances our understanding and our ability to manage the risk. So I think it's about starting small, but being targeted about where you can have a big impact with that sort of technology.
And so with the recent dramatic advancement of AI in particular, or the adoption of it, is that a really big component of digital twin? Have they existed only together, or where does it fit into it?
I'm not sure I would necessarily put them in the same context. The primary value of the digital twin is being a robust replica of reality, as close as you can get, right? The value is in, if I do this in the digital twin and X happens, I expect broadly the same kind of thing to happen in reality. And that's as much about capturing and representing the real world in the digital space, as it is about, like that. I suppose it's like weather forecasting is maybe a good analogy. We have models that try to represent the physics of the meteorological system and other Earth systems. And as you sort of level those up and watch how they interact, you get a representation of what's going to happen in the future. So, it's not to say that there aren't maybe predictive elements and there's not opportunities for machine learning and AI within the digital twins, especially as it relates to what will happen if I press this red button. But it is really important that you get the representation layer right before you get too wrapped up in the AI applications within the twin. At least from my vantage point, I think if you don't get that foundational representation right, how do you trust what the twin is telling you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating stuff. Do you think? There's advantages and positives here of particularly implementing AI into these things, but they're not always needed, and that's kind of maybe a lot the premise of what we're talking about today. I'm kind of keen to understand from your perspective the work you do and Informed Solutions experience with clients. What are the kind of negatives of AI? What are they being used for in a malicious intent, or potentially they're being used and causing a negative output instead? And I guess the real thing I'm looking for here is, I know people are just generally worried. We touched on this earlier a little bit, but is there anything in particular you guys are seeing that people should be worried about at the moment?
Obviously, as you can imagine, one of our sort of mission statements or goals is tech for good. So we spend most of our energy and effort on delivering on the opposite side and trying to assure against those sorts of negative impacts. I think as it relates, certainly on the malicious side, a big concern for me relates to cybersecurity, and in particular, sort of think of it as like a force multiplier. One of the common uses now for LLMs is code generation, and you can see a lot of code being created very quickly using these code generation tools, but not necessarily well assured and validated, in particular for security concerns. There's a research outfit inside Google that produces an annual report called the DORA report, DevOps something. Can't remember what the R and the A are. But last year and then again this year, they have reframed a little bit to be specifically about AI. And the most recent one was about software engineering in the era of artificial intelligence. And they've got all these metrics of things getting better, going in the right direction in this era, with the one exception of software instability getting worse. And that is one of the things that I think, worries me or concerns me about the direction that we're heading, is that, there's more humans now, there's more technology now, we're building more things, there's more deployments all over the place. And, we just saw last week with Cloudflare, I don't know if this impacted APAC or not.
Yeah.
But I saw a blog post from one of the guys from Cloudflare, and it was like 5 lines of code is what took down. It was like 3 hours and like half the internet was offline. And the fragility there, I guess, is one of the things that worries me. And so if you combine that fragility with instability, and then you layer on top that bad actors now have access to the same tools that can generate probes, or sort of attempts really rapidly, it's a real force multiplier on the malicious side to try and find vulnerabilities. And if you're potentially introducing more vulnerabilities through AI code generation on the other side, it just reinforces for me the importance of building robust systems, paying attention to how they're secured, making intelligent choices about who has access and why, to protect yourself against these threats. Because I don't want to sort of sound like a doomsayer or something, that there's no way out, right? It's not all hope is lost, but you do have to be savvy and pay attention to these things to keep yourself and your teams and customers safe.
There's definitely a good couple of things in that. I think the code vibers, I think they call them, that stuff's pretty scary, because they're
vibe coding
things. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. They're jumping into things pretty quick, and look, what they come out with is exciting and it's cool for 5 minutes until it has a massive vulnerability in it. And I think there's another discussion I've come across where developers are saying, we're not losing our jobs, we're now fixing code that someone got Claude to write for them, so they're just becoming quality assurance engineers instead. Fascinating stuff. I think there's a lot in this. There's a lot to unpack and think about moving forward. And things are moving really fast. AI is evolving super quick, and hopefully regulations, governance keep up. I guess my last question for you, though, is what do you see the kind of next 5 years looking like? What, in your opinion, would be a good result in 5 years' time, and what kind of worries you that might actually end up happening in 5 years' time?
I maybe it's self-evident from the conversation we've had, but I'm maybe more on the skeptical side of how rapid this technology is going to disrupt, or how rapidly we're going to see the payoff, I suppose. There's I think that there's a real incentive out of Silicon Valley where just stupendous capital has been deployed on behalf of, in particular in the infrastructure data center space, to deliver AI. And the incentive that creates is for the VC firms and the people developing the LLMs, the list goes on, to sell how transformative the tech is. And I think that's juxtaposed with what we're seeing out of things like the MIT study, which, the methodology aside, is another reinforcement that we've seen from all kinds of, McKinsey and others have suggested similarly, that the value of the technology is largely yet to be realized. And I don't think that means we won't realize it, but from my perspective as a practitioner and trying to leverage this tech to deliver value, there are a lot of things to connect and evolve. We talked about data platforms, governance, being able to being set up to take advantage of the technology. So that just takes time. We didn't see, the internet didn't just get switched on in 1995 or whatever, right? It was 15 years from the early kind of university networks getting connected to this global, for us to run the cable over the ocean floors to connect us all, wire us all together. So there's an undervalued or underrepresented infrastructure requirement, I think, in there. And so that's like one part of the kind of direction of travel and where things are going over the next 5 years. The other thing that I think, it's always a bit tricky trying to prophesize.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit more skeptical actually on the LLM side of things in their ability to be this all-in-one solution, right? They're currently sold very much as like a general purpose model that can do all the things that you want. It's not been my experience that you get general purpose, but not to the degree of quality and performance that I want for my mission critical, expertise, expert domains. So, within that context, I think we will see a lot more development of more specialized, more purpose-driven tools and models, to be really good at doing something that's useful. There's all kinds of different examples of what that might look like, but that for me, I think, is where the next 5 to 10 years is going, is really evolving how you take advantage of the underlying technology, but in a way that really does have a positive impact. You asked about concerns or sort of what maybe what keeps me up at night or something. I think the point I made earlier about vulnerability and the arms race in security is very paramount for me. I think there's a lot of chatter and a lot of people talking about, as you alluded to, what I would call in the American term white collar work, which is to say like knowledge workers losing their jobs and this massive layoffs and all this kind of stuff. And some of that is probable. Some of that is also potentially a correction to the COVID.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Reality, right? We saw a tremendous amount of hiring because suddenly overnight, everybody's on the internet all the time. And so you need more people to develop software. But, there might be some of that. But as we've seen with every technology, big disruptive technology, some jobs go away and new ones that never existed before appear that you didn't know, were going to exist. So that one, for me, it's not exactly that it's overblown, but it's maybe misses the forest for the trees, in that we're always living in a dynamic and evolving economy, and markets drive some things to go out of business and other things to compete for new domains.
Yeah,
I think I'm kind of an optimist. So the main one that strikes me is the security side of things, and that people aren't switched on to that.
And that's always been there, right? It's just getting exacerbated now because people have there's a lower barrier to entry now, supposedly.
Software is more brittle.
Really true. Yeah,
exactly.
So that's a great answer. I think I listen to a lot of podcasts that talk about this doom and gloom with people losing their jobs, particularly, and I've always been of the opinion it was the overhire at COVID period, and they're using AI as an excuse as opposed to just poor strategy and judgment. But
I would co-sign that, I think.
Yeah, surely more jobs will appear, new ones we never had before. What I also kind of felt I heard you say was that there's potentially an AI bubble that is like splitting the world at the moment, that some people say, no, there's no way. And that's because they've got, shares in NVIDIA at the moment. Whereas I'm sitting on the side of the fence where I'm convinced. There's a podcast that you might have heard of it. Better Offline, it's called. It's an English chap who just spends his entire life bringing evidence to why we're in an AI bubble. And
Nice.
if you want to listen to it, if anyone's going to listen to it, warning, there's a lot of swearing. He's a passionate dude, but it's very well researched, and it's just interesting to, what he's saying makes a lot of sense, and it's quite a worry. But then, like we saw with .com, if it happens, and it's got to happen, fine. AI is not going to go away. LLMs aren't going to go away. There'll just be another version of that afterwards. It doesn't hurt to be prepared if it is going to happen, and how we're going to do it. Interesting times. Last thing, I was wondering if you knew or had any recommendations for books or resources you think people would find interesting. What's one that comes to mind at the moment you would want to share?
So, it's a good question. And I think my answers as a practitioner are probably a little more in the engineering or sort of technical space. But I think there's a chap called Andre Karpathy, he was at Google and then he was at Tesla, and he has not that recently, last 3 years or so, broken out on his own and really taken up the mantle of being an AI educator. And I think he's very adept at finding intuitions or analogies that are immediately approachable to the layperson for how to think about how these things work. And there's a lot of anthropomorphizing of LLMs in particular. And I think he's very sober and realistic about presenting to people that, this is mathematics. It's mathematics and it's electronics. It's not a person, regardless of how much it sounds like a person. So, he has a YouTube channel. He has a blog. He has, he produces lots of resources that, I think fill the whole spectrum from, I'm sort of interested in this and I want to understand more. He's a really good resource. I would also recommend another podcast, actually. There's a podcast called Dwarkesh, which you might be familiar with. Dwarkesh.
Yeah, rings a bell.
Patel. Very deeply researched. He doesn't just do AI. He does all sorts of different topics. But he recently, maybe 2 months ago, interviewed Richard Sutton, who is colloquially known as the godfather of reinforcement learning. And some of the episode gets a little bit technical in how we actually build AI systems, but it's a really interesting conversation about how we think about intelligence that keeps rattling around in my head, the insights that are available there. And I think it presents a really concrete alternative maybe or different perspective to LLMs and how we think about building intelligent systems.
Awesome. That sounds like a really good one. I'll link those in the show notes so that people can check them out. And there seems to be some minds out there that are worth listening to, and finding their podcasts and YouTubes is really important. So thanks for recommending those.
Absolutely.
Greg, I want to thank you for your time today. And look, I think what you guys are doing it's really inspiring. It's reassuring as well that there are companies like Informed Solutions doing the work you're doing, particularly when it comes to healthcare and police and the government. Having you guys there helping these guys helps me, right? And it helps my family and the community. So yeah, it's valuable work for sure. And we're over this side of the world, we're pretty honored to be partnered with you guys and trying to spread that message and the values and the mission to this side of the planet and try and modernize things over here a little bit. So, but yeah, as I said, really thank you for all the work you're doing, the expertise you brought to the podcast as well, and for spending so much time walking me through everything. It's been really
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, and really enjoyed having it's not hard to convince me to sit down for 90 minutes to talk data science and AI.
That's good. That's good, because it's actually quite hard to find people who do. So you're very valuable to us in that respect. So Greg, thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'm going to leave you to probably get yourself another coffee, and we'll share all the links and things in the show notes, and people can find you through Informed Solutions. You're on things like LinkedIn and all those sorts of things, are you?
Yeah, we certainly are. Yep. And informed.com if you want to know more about the work we do and get in touch.
Awesome. Great. Thanks for your time again, Greg. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Ollie.